Emily Sinclair hadn't been back to Willow Creek in nearly 7 years. The small Georgia town sat nestled between rolling hills that in spring bloomed with dogwood and wild azalea, pretty as a postcard, mean as a rattlesnake. Her Mercedes felt conspicuously shiny against the backdrop of weathered pickup trucks parked in her mama's driveway. And wouldn't you know it, the minute she stepped through that screen door, the same one that had slammed behind her when she'd left with nothing but $200 and a head full of dreams, the air changed. Like when storm clouds roll in and the barometric pressure drops so quick your ears pop. Well, well, look what the cat dragged in, Uncle Hank drawled from his permanent position in Daddy's old recliner. He'd grown fatter around the middle, his suspenders straining like fence wire after a hard rain. Emily forced a smile. Good to see you too, Uncle Hank. Grammy Rose shuffled forward, arms outstretched, lavender scent crowding out the smell of pot roast. My sweet girl, finally home. Lord have mercy, you're skinny as a fence post in drought season. Behind Grammy Rose, Emily caught her cousin Shelby's eye roll. Some things never changed in this house. Grammy's worry about everybody's weight, Uncle Hank's perpetual dissatisfaction, and Shelby's simmering jealousy that followed Emily like a shadow. Mama appeared from the kitchen, wiping hands on an apron that Emily remembered from childhood. Faded flowers and a stubborn grease stain that looked like Texas. You're just in time. Dinner's ready. The dining room table, actually 3 tables pushed together and covered with Mama's good tablecloth, groaned under casserole dishes and her mother's famous buttermilk biscuits. Family members Emily barely recognized filled the chairs. Second cousins, great aunts, people who might not even be related at all but had been coming to Sunday dinner since before anyone could remember. So, Uncle Hank said as Emily spooned green bean casserole onto her plate, I hear you're some fancy tech executive now. It wasn't a question, it was bait. Emily's hand paused midair. She'd named her first venture capital fund Fence Post as a private joke. After all those times, family had called her too skinny, too dreamy, too useless as a fence post. I do all right, she said, passing the dish to Grammy. But Aunt Patty, Hank's wife with a tongue sharp as new scissors, wasn't letting it go. All right? Honey, we saw you in that business magazine. 30 under 40 or something. Said you sold your company for millions. Shelby snorted into her sweet tea. Must be nice. Emily cut into her pot roast, watching the juices run like summer rain on dry dirt. When she'd left Willow Creek, she'd sworn never to explain herself to these people again. Yet here she was, feeling 16 all over again, defending her every choice. Fortune named me in their 40 under 40 list last year, she corrected gently. And yes, my first company did well. Well enough to buy that fancy car, but not well enough to help family. Uncle Hank stabbed a biscuit with his fork. Your cousin Shelby's boy needs braces. Your Aunt Patty's still working double shifts at the hospital with her bad knees. And here you come, flash as a firefly, not offering a penny. The table went quiet as a church on Monday. Even the kids stopped squirming. Grammy Rose whispered, Hank, that's not dinner conversation. But Emily could see the question in everyone's eyes. The unspoken judgment. She'd escaped. She'd succeeded. Why hadn't she shared? That old feeling, the one she paid her therapist good money to help her manage, crawled up her spine. That mixture of guilt and rage that felt like fire ants under her skin. The pot roast turned to sawdust in her mouth. She thought of the spreadsheet on her laptop, each family member's name, each loan she'd sent over the years. Money for Shelby's nursing school she'd dropped out of. Money for Uncle Hank's truck repair. Money for second cousin Jaden's community college that he never attended. They'd all come calling once news of her success had trickled back to Willow Creek. And she'd always answered, hoping maybe this time would be different. This time they'd use the money as promised. This time they'd be proud instead of resentful. She'd been fixing fences that were never meant to stand. I reckon she thinks she's better than us now, Uncle Hank continued, his voice rising. Got herself out of Willow Creek and forgot who raised her. Emily set her fork down with a clink that sounded like pennies dropping into a well. That's not fair, Uncle Hank. Fair? His face flushed redder than the tomatoes in Mama's garden. I'll tell you what's not fair. You owe us. Your mama cleaned houses so you could go to that fancy university. We all chipped in when your car broke down sophomore year. And now you're rich as cream and acting like we're just country dirt beneath your designer shoes. The table seemed to tilt beneath her hands. Emily noticed her knuckles had gone white against the floral tablecloth, the same one they'd used at every Thanksgiving, Christmas, and Easter of her childhood. Back when she'd believed family meant safety. Her mother's voice came soft as cotton. "Hank, please." She just got home. But Uncle Hank was standing now, finger pointed at Emily like an accusation. "You owe us for getting rich without us. Without your family. Who do you think you are?" Time slowed like molasses in January. Emily saw herself as if from above. The prodigal daughter returned, surrounded by faces both familiar and strange, all expecting something she couldn't give. With a calm that surprised even her, Emily stood. The chair scraped against the hardwood floor, the same floor she'd helped Daddy refinish the summer before he died. Before cancer ate him up and spit out hospital bills that had nearly buried Mama. She reached into her purse, the one Shelby had earlier snidely commented must have cost more than her monthly mortgage, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It had gone soft at the creases from being carried so long. "Funny? Then what's this?" she said, handing it to Uncle Hank. His reading glasses sat perched on his head. He made a show of putting them on, squinting at the paper like it might bite. Then his face changed, turned pale as flour dust. "Read it," Emily said. Her voice didn't sound like her own. It sounded like Daddy's, how he'd speak when he meant business. No arguing allowed. Uncle Hank cleared his throat. "Receipt of loan to Henry James Sinclair, amount $32,500. Purpose, investment in Sinclair auto repair. Terms, repayment with 3% interest within 5 years." The date on the receipt was 6 years ago, Emily's first big bonus check. Almost all of it had gone to Uncle Hank's failing business. "Keep reading," Emily said. Uncle Hank's voice grew smaller. "Additional loans, $4,700 for emergency roof repair, $7,200 for new diagnostic equipment, $3,000 for outstanding tax bill." The room was silent as a grave now. Even the little ones sensed something big was happening. "Turn it over," Emily instructed. On the back, in Uncle Hank's own cramped handwriting, "I swear on my brother's grave I'll pay every cent back. Don't tell the family." Aunt Patty's eyes went wide as dinner plates. "Hank, you said the bank gave you that business loan." Emily reached back into her purse and pulled out a manila folder. It landed on the table with a thwack that made the sweet tea glasses jump. "That's just Uncle Hank's receipt. I've got one for everybody who's asked for money. Shelby's nursing school. Cousin Mike's bail money. Aunt Patty's knee surgery that insurance wouldn't cover." She hadn't planned this. Had promised herself she'd just have a nice dinner, make polite conversation, then retreat to the hotel she'd booked in the next town over. But something had snapped loose inside her, like a branch too long bent. "I never asked for repayment," Emily continued, her voice steady as still water. "Not once. I figured family helps family. But I won't sit here and be accused of forgetting where I came from when I've sent back more money than I ever took." Grammy Rose's hands trembled around her napkin. "Oh, my stars." Shelby stared at her plate, cheeks flaming. She'd been the first to call after Emily's company made the news. Her son didn't need braces. He needed rehab, and insurance wouldn't cover the good facility. $15,000 Emily had sent, no questions asked. "You never said anything," Mama whispered. "Y'all never wanted me to succeed, not really," Emily said, and the truth of it hit her like summer lightning. "You wanted me close, wanted me the same. Every time I sent money, I thought maybe it would prove I still belonged, that I still cared. But it just made the distance wider, didn't it?" Uncle Hank's mouth opened and closed like a catfish on a dock. The receipt dangled from his fingers, evidence of all his big talk about bootstraps and self-reliance, now exposed as hollow as an old stump. Emily remembered suddenly, clear as creek water, the day she'd told them about her scholarship to MIT. Instead of celebration, Uncle Hank had snorted. "What, Shelby's community college ain't good enough for you? Think you're special?" And Daddy, God rest him, had stepped in. "She is special, Hank. Let her fly." Only Daddy and Mama had driven her to Boston. Only they had helped her unpack her single suitcase in the dorm room she shared with a girl from California who'd never even heard of Willow Creek. Only they had looked around at the red brick buildings and students from all over the world and hadn't made her feel small for wanting to be among them. "I made something of myself," Emily said softly. "Isn't that what we're supposed to do? Isn't that the dream? Did you want me to fail just so I'd have to come back?" Mama reached across the table and covered Emily's hand with her own. Worn from years of cleaning other people's houses, nails short and practical. "Some folks get scared when the sapling grows taller than the tree, honey. The metaphor hung in the air like Georgia humidity, impossible to ignore, hard to breathe through. "I didn't come back to fight," Emily said, suddenly tired to her bones. "I came back because—" She hesitated, realizing she wasn't entirely sure why she'd come. To prove something, to reconnect, to finally close a door? "Because it's still home," Mama finished for her. "No matter how far you go." Uncle Hank stood abruptly, chair legs screeching on hardwood. "I need some air." The screen door slammed behind him hard enough to make the window blinds rattle. Aunt Patty looked mortified as Christmas. "Emily, I had no idea Hank had been—" Emily waved her apology away. "It doesn't matter anymore." But it did matter. It mattered like rain after drought. What followed was the strangest dinner Emily could remember. Conversation resumed in fits and starts. Someone passed the butter. Cousin Mike's boy spilled his tea and cried. Normal things happening in the shadow of something that had shifted forever, like furniture rearranged in a familiar room. Grammy Rose reached for Emily's cheek, her hand cool and papery. "You remind me of your grandfather. Backbone, like an oak tree." Emily had never met her grandfather. He died before she was born. But Daddy used to tell stories about him. The only man in 3 counties who'd stood up to the bank during foreclosures in the bad years, organizing farmers to support each other when crops failed and money dried up. After dinner, Emily helped Mama with the dishes, an automatic habit from childhood. Through the window, she could see Uncle Hank sitting on the porch steps, shoulders slumped like a man carrying a load he couldn't put down. "He's prideful," Mama said, following her gaze. "Always has been. Your daddy used to say Hank would rather eat crow than admit he was wrong." Emily scrubbed at a stubborn bit of dried gravy. "I shouldn't have done that. Not in front of everyone." "Maybe not," Mom agreed, drawing a plate with methodical circles. "But it's been building a long time, like storm clouds in summer. Sometimes the rain has to come." They worked in companionable silence for a few minutes. From the living room came the sounds of the Braves game and children playing some complicated game involving sofa cushions. "Why didn't you tell me you were helping everybody?" Mama finally asked. Emily thought about that time, 3 years ago now, when she'd gotten the call about Mama's roof leaking. How she'd arranged for the best contractor in the county, paid him directly so Mama wouldn't try to find a cheaper option, sworn him to secrecy about the real cost. "You'd have told me not to," Emily said simply. Mama smiled, the creases around her eyes deepening. True as sunrise. But the real reason sat between them, unspoken. Every dollar Emily sent home was a reminder of the gulf between her new life and the one she'd left behind. Every problem she could solve with money was proof she no longer belonged completely to Willow Creek. She'd become Mama's pride and the family's shame all at once. Emily dried her hands on a dish towel that was frayed at the edges but smelled like the same laundry detergent from her childhood. "I'm going to talk to Uncle Hank." The porch steps creaked under her weight. Another familiar sound. Uncle Hank didn't look up as she sat beside him. The evening had turned cool, crickets starting their nightly chorus from the fields beyond the yard. "You come to rub it in?" he asked, voice gruff as sandpaper. Emily watched a lightning bug blink on and off near the old oak tree. When she was little, Uncle Hank had helped her catch them in mason jars, poked holes in the lids so they could breathe. He'd shown her how to identify constellations on clear nights, his knowledge of the stars surprising in a man who'd never finished high school. "No," she said. "I came to tell you to tear up that receipt." He turned to her then, suspicion narrowing his eyes. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I'm not asking for the money back, any of it, from anyone." The silence stretched between them like old elastic, worn but not quite breaking. "Why the hell not?" he finally asked. "You made your point. We're all just leeches, ain't we?" Emily sighed. "That's not. You think I don't know what they're all saying in there now? Poor old Hank, talking big, while his fancy niece bankrolled him. My own wife looking at me like I'm a stranger." His voice cracked on the last word, and Emily remembered suddenly how he'd taught her to drive in his old pickup, patient with her grinding the gears, never once raising his voice. "Uncle Hank," she said carefully, "do you remember when the mill closed and half the town lost their jobs? You let 3 families live in your hunting cabin until they got back on their feet. Didn't charge them a dime." He scoffed. "That's different." "Is it? You helped because you could. So did I." The porch swing creaked as Grammy Rose came out to join them, settling her small frame between them like a buffer or a bridge. "Your uncle's just like your daddy was," she said, patting Emily's knee. "Stubborn as a tick on a hound dog. Can't stand taking help, but would give you the shirt off his back. Uncle Hank made a noise that might have been protest. Hush now, Grammy continued. Emily, your uncle was the one who drove to Atlanta every weekend when you were in that coding competition your senior year. Sat in the parking lot because he didn't want to distract you. Said you needed to focus on your future. Emily turned to her uncle, surprised. You never came inside. Wouldn't have understood a lick of what you were doing anyway, he mumbled. All that computer mumbo-jumbo. The revelation hung between them, that he'd been there, silent witness to her first steps away from Willow Creek. That perhaps his anger wasn't just about money or perceived abandonment, but something more complicated, like watching a bird leave the nest and being both proud and bereft at once. Grammy Rose patted both their hands. Family's like kudzu, honey, all tangled up and impossible to separate clean. But it holds the soil together when the hard rains come. Later, as Emily prepared to leave for her hotel, Uncle Hank approached her by her car. He'd folded the receipt into a tiny square, which he pressed into her palm without meeting her eyes. I'll pay it back, he said gruffly. Not because I have to, because I want to. Emily nodded, understanding this was the closest thing to an apology she would get. In his own way, he was acknowledging her, not just as family he was entitled to, but as a person with boundaries and dignity. The auto shop doing any better? She asked. He shrugged. Electric cars are coming. Nobody around here knows how to fix them yet. Emily thought about the tech incubator she'd just funded, one specializing in rural business development. You know, there might be an opportunity there, if someone was interested in getting ahead of the curve. For the first time that evening, Uncle Hank looked directly at her. Not with resentment or shame, but with something like curiosity. Like he was seeing not just the girl who'd left, but the woman who'd returned. I might know somebody who'd be interested, he said carefully. Mama hugged her goodbye with a fierceness that spoke of years of missing her. Next time, stay at the house, she whispered. Hotel money is wasted money. Emily smiled, knowing she'd be back sooner than 7 years this time. The distance hadn't disappeared, would never completely vanish. But something had shifted, like Earth after a long freeze. As she drove away, she glanced in the rearview mirror at the family still standing in the yard, illuminated by the porch light against the gathering dusk. They looked both smaller and larger than she remembered, diminished by time and perspective, yet still occupying an outsized place in the landscape of her heart. Some roots, she thought, run deeper than others. And sometimes they need a hard rain to remember they're still growing.